Hello, everybody. I'm Dan Lapel for New Focus Recordings, and I'm really happy to be joined here by David Fulmer to talk about his upcoming single release, Skies Acetylene, with New York Phil, players in New York Phil for the Contact series. How's it going, Dave?
Dan, thanks so much. Fantastic to be here. I'm so thrilled about this release. And it seemed like yesterday that I was writing this. And as I was digging out some old manuscript pages, it reminded me of the images and some of the musical symbols that are embedded in this piece.
Great. Well, let's jump right in and talk. You've whetted my interest, so I'm happy to jump right in and talk about that. That's really cool.
Yeah, the commission came about. I was so thrilled to have been commissioned by the New York Philharmonic for the occasion of their 175th anniversary, which in itself is something very special. There's a sort of a lot of weight attached to celebrating a symphonic orchestra, a philharmonic of this capacity, of this size, of this legacy and history. So it's something special. And for me personally, I had such a close relationship with almost all the members. It really made sense for me as a composer, as an artist, to be writing for these just phenomenal musicians. And it made the compositional process that much more interesting from my perspective, knowing that every note that was going on to my manuscript page would be sort of illuminated by this previous relationship of music making.
Yeah, great. And while we're on that topic, let's mention the wonderful musicians who are on the recording playing the piece. Mindy Kaufman on flutes, Nancy Allen on harp, Daniel Druckmann on percussion, Eric Hubner on piano, Max Zugner on bass, and the excellent Jeffrey Milarski conducting. So, to be clear, this piece was written, as you say, for the 175th anniversary of New York Phil, which is an amazing landmark in itself in terms of the musical history of the United States. I think it's sort of hugely significant, but also for the dedicated new music series and curation that the New York Phil was doing for several years called Contact, right?
Yeah, and it was this sort of incredible resource of new music coming into the city. And when Alan Gilbert came in as director in 2009, Contact began. And it was this, again, a showcase of what's new, what's bold, what's being written today, where the ink on the paper is still wet. And that's what was so intriguing. And it just so happens that this was officially the last of the Contact series that hosted this particular work. So in many ways, it concluded this incredible tenure of Alan's with the Philharmonic. And on the dedication page, of course, is Alan's name, along with these amazing musicians. So Contact was such an incredible resource.
Yeah, I always found it to be a really great and unique series. Also because there was something about the fact that it was featuring players from the Phil, but players from the Phil who were really dedicated to new music, which is like a sort of unique subset of musicians, as opposed to sort of players who are sort of primarily playing new music or players who are primarily playing orchestral music. But this was the Venn diagram meeting place, right? And obviously,
yeah, I really love that analogy, because I think when we're talking about an orchestra as celebrated as the New York Philharmonic, I mean, the world's most celebrated philharmonic, we sort of get into free association, Brahms, Mozart, Tchaikovsky, Bruckner, and so forth. And we're thinking about these very larger musical contexts within which all this glorious music lives. And basically, Contact was a way of bringing all of this new music into the very hands of these specific musicians, as you had articulated.
Yeah. Yeah. So sorry, I have a motorcycle noise outside, but great. So and you wrote in the liner notes, which was interesting to me, that there was some literary influence behind this piece, right? Poet Hart Crane.
Yeah, yeah. So these poems that I was really infatuated with at the time by Hart Crane, one of my favorite poets. There's just a very sonic touch to these works, and I think to his work in general, and many of what you and I would call timbre, I think is there in these pieces, and one particular poem, to Brooklyn Bridge. There's a beautiful line. A rip tooth of skies is acetylene. And there's a pictorial representation of that. But within that, further than that, deeper perhaps, if we sort of peel off the palimpsests, there's a musical fundamental there for me to work with. And I sort of remember sketching. I remember reading the poem and sketching just simple, like notes that I liked, and I sort of just described them as simply as I could. I'm looking at different chords that say exotic. I'm looking at variant, R, redux duplicant timbral resonance, variant T prime superscriptio 1, triploidal variation of hyperchromostasis. And it sort of sounds complex in a way, but it's not, because I basically approach this work like I do any other, which is I take a very, very large plate of composition paper. I just sort of throw ingredients on the page and see how it works.
Yeah.
And inevitably, there are going to be things that you want to sort of extract and sort of pull out. There's other things that you really want to highlight and create this sort of very cushy and beautiful atmosphere for. So
Well,
that's what my sketches represent. I just saw these. I
yeah.
took these out. I haven't seen these in a few years. So it's that was, I think, part of my reaction to the Hart Crane.
Yeah.
And I think the musical sort of vernacular in there is very apparent.
Yeah. Well, it is cool to sort of get a window back into the early part of your compositional process and how it linked back to the poems. Maybe we can listen to an excerpt now that sort of really highlights some of these very rich, colorful, vibrant sonorities that sort of grew out of those initial sketches, I think. So here's an excerpt from the piece that really delves into that. Beautiful. One of the things that really jumped out to me spending time with this piece is the sort of a duality that you have established between individual sort of solistic lines from the members of the ensemble, and then sort of reintegrating them back into the ensemble texture, particularly with the flute, which sort of seems almost like it plays a protagonist role, sort of drawing the piece through its structural trajectory. You want to talk about that? Is there some kind of sort of Carter-esque characterization going on in terms of the instrument qualities and personas?
Yeah, I love the way in which you describe it, because it sounds like that, and it sounds as if there is a dichotomy between uh, the sort of soloistic type of writing and then the more orchestral ensemble-ish writing. I think in all of my pieces, whether they're big or small, I try to write lines that are virtuosically singular. And I think that's something I strive for personally, so that each player is just so integrated in their part, and I think it also has to do a lot with the aesthetic with which they approach. And I want my dear friends at the New York Philharmonic, I want my musicians to sort of approach the page and be, in some ways, maybe a little bit overwhelmed with what they see, in a way that pushes them to take it apart and say, oh, well, I'd really like to play it this way. And what if I took a lot of rubato here and this, that, and the other? And I love that. And my philosophy has always been, as soon as I draw the double bar, it's not my piece any longer. And so one of the joys of working with the New York Philharmonic and having such a close relationship with all these musicians was simply that I got to work with them separately in a way that really resonated to their virtuosity. I wanted to highlight every single player. And I remember working in the green room with Mindy and just experimenting with different flute fingerings and harmonics. And it worked. It was such a sympathetic sort of interaction. And I love that, because at the heart of all this piece is about nothing except the players of the New York Philharmonic. And my music always happens to be about people. It's not necessarily, and albeit it is very reactive music. It reacts to a lot of different things going on. But I think in selecting the instrumentation for this work, I was very much aware of those instrumentalists in particular, and how they would interact with each other, and how I would reinterpret certain dimensions of the music that I would write for them. The flute just happens to be one of my favorite instruments. That being said, I can say the same thing for harp and double bass and percussion and and so forth. But I do have a sort of a very long relationship with this instrument. I've written a lot of pieces for flute, and a lot of my larger works, whether they're orchestral or concerti or larger ensemble, the flute is always very prominent, simply because it occupies this sonic sort of universe in its own. It doesn't need any other manicured sound around it. It's so powerful. And so this was my chance, after speaking with Mindy, and we sort of went back and forth, and it was this inspiring dialogue of which flutes worked best. And I had it in mind. My initial sort of architectural design was, okay, I want to start really low with the bass flute. I want to get up to C flute, and then I really want to expand and end with piccolo. And the work ends in this very fragile texture, separated by 7 octaves. We have the double bass all the way down in that low E string, or even with tunings low B string, and the piccolo is up there in just a stratosphere all alone. And it's the different sounds of the flute that perhaps compel me most as a composer, as a performer myself. I'm intrigued by the registration, as well as what the registration tells our audience. What's the story of that registration? And for me, the piccolo, it's got this incredible, this bore, this sort of this conical this tube in which you hear literally the curvature, and that's what was intriguing to me. There are moments, I think, where everybody does have a solo. Nancy, I believe, has the very first sort of utterance after the short introduction, where all of the instruments articulate this sort of very slow processional-esque entrance. The harp emerges, and for me, the harp is it's such a naturally resonant, organically resonant instrument. And then we hear flute, and then we hear lots of percussion, and that's another sort of can of worms, right? I mean, the whole percussion, for me, I'm obsessed, absolutely infatuated with metal percussion. I like to bow it, I like to scrape it, I like to dip it in water, and all these sorts of other perhaps unusual techniques that provide very unique sonic stamps in my music, in my musical landscapes. So percussion was another thing, and getting the right metal to sound at the right time. And Dan has always been such an inspiration for me. So having worked with him so closely on this piece is just another sort of part of that building block.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Let's listen to some music that reflects some of what you're saying about the different sort of solo and then ensemble combinations and how they sort of illuminated these instrumental qualities. Great. That was a very illuminating excerpt to sort of hear uh, this duality between soloistic and then reintegration into the ensemble, these different roles for the instruments. One thing that occurs to me hearing you talk about the Hart Crane poem, the extent to which the piece was shaped by the nature of the commission by the New York Phil and the 175th anniversary, is it's got me wondering if the at the core of the piece is an interest in sort of expressing a certain kind of New Yorkness, like a sort of expressive New Yorkness, almost maybe along the lines of Charles Ives' Central Park at night. I might be mangling the title, but was that something that was sort of in the ether of the genesis of this piece?
Yeah, I think so. I think it may have been, and perhaps it was unconscious at the moment. And I may have, here or there, been aware of the exotic imagery that Crane was alluding to and actually creating and fabricating with words. And that, to me, I think compelled a certain musical style, a certain sound world. And just as you said, there may be a very sort of New York-ish sound in there that I interpret, and I don't think that New York represents any one particular aesthetic or style. I think the beauty in our musical families, in our musical cultures, in our artistic communities, is that we have everything, and that's what makes it so rich. But for me, I think the Hart Crane, it did sound like New York, and I remember walking up to Fisher for rehearsals, or to Geffen Hall for rehearsals. And yeah, I would be aware. If I looked west off the Hudson, I would see literally a ripped tooth of skies acetylene. I would see these huge crevices sort of be illuminated with a sunset or some sort of a light, perhaps a canopy of light in some way. So for me, I think I am a product in many ways of the environment and what happens around. I think, at least from a sonic perspective, is going to be in the piece. I think that's sort of inevitable. And again, in the pursuit of celebrating the New York Philharmonic and the musicians of the New York Philharmonic. So yeah, I think this piece is about each one of those musicians. It's about their particular sound, in so much that you know, I want this piece to be performed different every single time, and this recording is just so phenomenal. I, however, don't believe that it's the only way to perform the piece. I think the next time it gets played, next time they play it, next time another ensemble plays it, next time another orchestra plays it, it's going to sound, you know, perhaps contain different contours, different sort of dynamic shadings, different liberties, whether it's rubato or something temporal. I love when musicians get inside of the page and just start making it their own. They either tear up the piece of paper and say it's mine, or they really sort of draw and make their own phrase structures and so forth.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, I mean, something about, I think sometimes we associate a sort of a New York expressive character with this sort of rhythmic propulsion, right? But there's this other side to it, which I sense in your piece, which is like a sort of uh, an expressive density in a way. If you would think of maybe like stuff that is characterized as sort of Americana or these expansive voicings, big sort of large interval sizes and stuff. But your piece has this, well, it also, it grows over time, right? As you said, the piccolo ends up quite high and the bass ends up in its lowest register by the end. But the trajectory of it, it sort of starts, it seems to start in this very compact place in terms of voicing and register, and then sort of expand as it grows, which sort of strikes me as the density aspect is very key to our experience as New Yorkers, I think, obviously, and finding.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I agree, and I think, you know, you said it so elegantly. I think New York in general does have a sound in many ways, only because there's been many works with New York in their title.
sure.
You know, I'm thinking of composers, and if we're talking, you know, about rhythm, let's just sort of take two poles on the spectrum. We have a composer like Steve Reich, who
Right.
has literally tried to capture very specific sounds of work on, you know, in the downtown, in the financial district. There are machinery motions in the background. You hear the steady beats of the sledgehammers and the jackhammers and all of the other things. On the other side, just about 5 or 6 streets up, you had Elliott Carter, who was working with an entirely different landscape of rhythmic pendulums, sort of swinging back and forth.
Yeah, yeah.
And while my music does not necessarily have anything to do with either of those two avenues, it is in fact my representation of what I see and what I hear under my lens.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I definitely heard that, and but I also found it a unique lens into that experience, which is always great and refreshing. So we're really looking forward to this. The album will come out on August 6th. It's FCR 306, and you can find it at all the places that you would expect to find newly released music, and including our website and our Bandcamp page. And Dave, I can't thank you enough for taking a few minutes to give us some insight into the genesis and the background behind this piece.
Dan, thanks so much. It's been a pleasure. Please tune in and listen to these magnificent players. They are extraordinary. And Dan, thanks again. This has been great.
My pleasure. Take care. Bye.